Tonight on Greater Boston, I'm Liz Nieslas, in for Jim Browdy, and we're taking a closer look at the aid in dying debate, with Beacon Hill lawmakers once again considering the issue. I'm joined by an advocate whose wife ended her life after a terminal diagnosis, and a disability rights activist who has serious concerns about such a potential law. Then later, if the Supreme Court follows through on overturning Roe v. Wade, how your online presence could pretty easily help people figure out if you broke the law in getting an abortion. Medical aid in dying, known to many as physician-assisted suicide, has a lot of support right now in Massachusetts. A Boston Globe Suffolk University poll out last week found nearly 77% of people believe an adult with an incurable terminal illness who is mentally sound should be able to request a medication that would end their life. And after more than 10 years of legislative efforts, that issue is once again before state lawmakers, with a bill that advanced through one committee and is currently sitting with another. Of course, not everyone is on board with that idea, and some have serious concerns about how such a law could potentially be used and abused, like John Kelly, who joins me now. He's the director of Second Thoughts Massachusetts, which describes itself as a progressive disability rights group against assisted suicide. We're also joined by Dan Diaz, who's in town this week to meet with lawmakers, pushing for the passage of this bill, after his late wife, Brittanys Maynard, made national news in 2014 with her decision to end her life following a terminal diagnosis. Dan, perhaps you can remind people your particular story. Some may be very familiar with your wife's situation. At the age of 29, she was diagnosed with a terminal brain cancer, and you both moved to Oregon, which then was really the state that allowed her to take advantage of physician-assisted death, and she took a fatal course of barbiturates, I believe. People really want to understand the thought process of someone who is going through that kind of pain, who gets to a decision that they want physician-assisted suicide. Can you paint the picture of what was going on then, and really what was going through her mind, how she came to that decision?
Certainly. So we discovered that brain tumor. It was actually New Year's Day. It was January 1st, 2014. Brittanys had brain surgery to remove the tumor material that they could safely get to. They were only able to get about 35% of that tumor. It was massive. At that point, they told Brittanys that she had 3 to 5 years to live. Brittanys is only 29 years old, mind you. And unfortunately, just at the next follow-up MRI, the tumor showed signs that it was growing aggressively, indicative of a GBM, a glioblastoma multiforme. And at that point, Brittanys said, well, we will move to Oregon, because at least there, Brittanys could take back that little bit of control. Brittanys was not going to allow the brain tumor to basically be in the driver's seat and dictate how much suffering she might have to endure. She's already dealing with pain that not even morphine could alleviate, nausea, vomiting, the seizures terrified her the most. And so we moved to Oregon. Brittanys had to find a house for us to rent on Craigslist, find a new medical team, establish residency. And during that time, while we were there, we were researching every clinical trial. We're doing everything we can to extend her life. But the truth is that modern medicine and hospice and palliative care are wonderful fields of medicine, but they are not able to keep a person from suffering in all cases. And so Brittanys simply had that assurance that if things got bad, she could utilize, it's a sleeping medicine, she could utilize that medication and experience a gentle dying process.
But
that's what this legislation is about.
Yeah.
And the safeguards are rigorous that are in place.
I have to ask you, though, Dan, back then, did you have any moment where you tried to convince her that this was not the right course? Were you always feeling like this was right?
Well, yeah, and what you just mentioned, along with the 77% of the individuals in Massachusetts, the thought surrounding this, and all Brittanys was doing was pursuing an option. Her hope is that she wouldn't have to utilize the medication, but she's pursuing the option to ensure that she doesn't have to suffer. Again, that's the crux of this. The opponents like to muddy the waters and make it seem and bring in things that have nothing to do with this. This is a self-directed. Brittanys is the one making the decision, applying for it, qualifying for it, and finally receiving that medication. So my support of her was very simple because, and I challenge any of the people watching this now, simply put yourself in her shoes and think to yourself, are you willing to roll the dice and allow cancer to dictate what your final few days on this green earth might be like?
So,
and so my support of her was recognizing that if I was in her shoes, I would be doing the same thing. I would just want to know that I have that option.
All right, John Kelly, I want to hear what brought you to this issue.
What brought me to this issue was that I had an accident at the age of 25, and people described me as paralyzed from the neck down. And my own father wished that I had died in the accident. And people have told me that they would rather be dead than like me. And so my heart goes out to Mr. Diaz and Brittanys' family for what Brittany went through. But individual cases make bad case law. And so we have a situation where many people do not report pain as a major issue, that when it comes to the actual decision making, it turns out to be based on disability issues. And the very same issues that people use to disqualify me as a full human being are used by people to disqualify themselves and by their families to disqualify themselves from living because of such things as feeling like a burden. More than half of people out in Oregon over these years are feeling like a burden. That means that other people are making them feel like a burden. We look to systemic issues, like the fact that there's no home care benefit in Medicare. People are faced with the choice of going to a nursing home or living at home with resentful helpers not getting the needs they met. And as someone who has felt like a burden, I can tell you it's just a horrible feeling.
So, Dan, how do you get around that point that family members who want to just make life easier for the family members they are burdening will choose this path?
Yes. For starters, we have over 40 years of data, and actually a letter which we regularly reach out to, the Disability Rights Organ. They are a federally mandated, they are mandated under federal law to investigate complaints of abuse or neglect of individuals with disabilities, including inappropriate actions taken to hasten the death of an individual. I'm reading from the letter from the executive director, and it says that since the passage of Oregon's Death with Dignity law, this covers 20 years, DRO has not, he writes, DRO has never, to my knowledge, received a complaint that a person with disabilities was coerced or being coerced to make use of the act. And the thing is this, it's in order to qualify for this, just to be clear, you do not qualify because you are disabled. You do not qualify because you are old or infirm. Two physicians independent of one another have to agree that this individual is terminally ill with 6 months or less to live. That person has to be mentally competent. They make the request both verbally and in writing. There's a waiting period. There are witnesses involved. The biggest safeguard is that patient has to consume this medication on her own. And so whenever I'm asked, well, what are the protections, the safeguards that I would offer somebody to members of the disability community, it's built right into the law. My question is this: what would you offer my wife, Brittany, so that she, or anybody here in Massachusetts, so that she does not have to endure being tortured to death by that brain tumor?
John, how do you answer that question? I mean, how much pain is enough? I mean, should the government be deciding how much pain people should endure?
I'm not a doctor, Liz, and that's not up to me, but I've been reassured by palliative care experts that pain can be relieved and that people can be made comfortable. And if need be, there's palliative sedation in which the person is sedated and allow the dying process to occur without feeling pain. Now, I would just like to talk about this terminal diagnosis that Mr. Diaz holds up as some kind of scientific fact. An NPR report said recently that up to 20% of people who enter hospice with a 6-month diagnosis do not die in 6 months. Ted Kennedy was given 3 to 6 months to live in Massachusetts, and he lived 15 more memory-filled moments as described by his widow, Virginia Kennedy.
So Dan,
And
yeah, this is an interesting point. If disease prognosis, if a diagnosis is uncertain, and in many cases with cancer, those prognoses are wrong, isn't this a bit like capital punishment where you may end up killing people who actually are innocent?
Well, no, because nothing is ever done to the patient. So, and thank you for bringing up this point. I want to have this conversation. Outliving your prognosis, whether you're in hospice care or qualified for this program, that's called success. The goal is to live. The goal is to live as long as possible. Let me put it this way. I would like nothing more than for Brittany to be sitting right here next to me, explaining to you for herself why having the option of medical aid in dying is so meaningful to her. Now, as far as the studies, by and large, what they show is that doctors, if anything, tend to overestimate what a person is, the life expectancy that they have. But again, for those who outlive whatever diagnosis or the length of time that they may have left, again, that is called success. There is no 6 months is simply to qualify for this medication. But that's not some sort of deadline where a person needs to utilize it. However, and the data supports this, that by and large, those individuals that are enrolled in hospice, so many times, and you hear this from medical directors of hospice care facilities and the nurses who say, people come to us too late. They come to us, they're basically rushing in the door saying, hurry, 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 our loved one is suffering. And that person is enrolled in hospice for maybe a week, 2 weeks, and then they die. And the family, and Brittany had excellent palliative and hospice care. And the services and resources that it provide, just as an aside, as a proponent of that, please, the general message, Brittany's story was much more than just medical aid in dying. Have these conversations early. Fill out your advanced healthcare directives. That was Brittany's true, message as far as end of life care. Medical aid in dying was a part of that for her. And she wanted this to be available for people to utilize if they were to find themselves in her predicament.
So Dan, you, I know, have answered the question about the slippery slope many times. But if, for example, someone is unable to self-administer the pill they are supposed to administer, what happens then? Does someone give them the pill? And is that not a step toward euthanasia?
No, as I mentioned, the criteria for utilizing this program is that person has to be able to consume those medications. Brittany has to be able to drink. It was a whole process. In her case, it was secobarbital. There was capsules. We had to open it. The powder was emptied into a glass. That powder was mixed with water, and then Brittany has to be able to consume that medication. It's not something that is given to her. It's not something that is through an IV. That patient has to voluntarily consume that on their own. But what you mentioned is interesting because and let's be honest, that's currently what happens behind closed doors right now. In the absence of this legislation, people are taking matters into their own hands. And that's where I would say, with all respect, Mr. Kelly, that's where the abuse is occurring. People will stockpile meds. These are the meds right here. This is hydromorphone. This is Dilaudid. This is 4 times stronger than morphine. 50 of these pills is 200 milligrams. That's the equivalent of 800 milligrams of morphine. I weigh 190 pounds. That is enough to put me to sleep for good tonight. And in order for Brittanys to get this, you just have to be in pain. There's not two physicians reviewing your case, making sure that you're terminally ill, mentally competent, not suffering from depression.
Can
So
I
this
speak
is what
to this,
occurs
Liz?
behind closed doors.
Yeah, go
right
ahead,
now.
John. Go ahead, John.
Well, first off, 4% of people sentenced to capital punishment have been estimated to be innocent. Out in Oregon, they started reporting last year that 4% of people were still alive at 6 months. We could have a lot more success, as Mr. Diaz defines it, if 12 to 15% or even 20% would survive 6 months, like the study shows. Then Mr. Diaz says that, you have to take it yourself. There's no requirement. There's nothing that happens if you don't do it. And it is at home. It is behind closed doors. And so we have no idea what happens with the half of people with no official witness there.
Okay,
And as
yeah.
far as
Yeah.
and as far as no abuses, please Google the name Wendy Melcher, who somehow got included in the Death with Dignity program after 2 nurses tried to kill her with morphine suppositories.
So,
The
John,
Oregon Nursing Board hid it and did nothing about it.
okay, John,
No
Dan, we
one has been-
unfortunately, I do have to cut you off. I just want to end on this note. In 2012, there was a ballot on this issue in Massachusetts. It was defeated by a very small margin.